I love that song by Rabbi Shlomo Katz, Boi V'Shalom. It's the ending part of Lecha Dodi, the song with which we welcome Shabbos. It's only Wednesday, but hey, we're over the middle of the week, and we can certainly say Good Shabbos a couple of days early. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Yesterday at the end of the show, I said I would go at noon Pacific today, and I ended up being about an hour late. And it's only because I kept working to get this daf straight. This one, we're going to work our way through a Talmudic argument where it's really going to be about parsing between one thing and another and keeping the argument straight and understanding what Rabbah is saying and what Rava is saying. We have to keep the subtleties straight. We have to keep the nuances straight. We have to understand what is between one and another view. And if we can sharpen our thinking enough so that we can keep those two views clear, well, then we've sharpened our thinking, and that's going to benefit us in all areas of our life. Let us light up the darkness. Who's in the house with us today? Stephen Giger is in from Dover, New Hampshire. John Capiello from Branford, Connecticut. James Roth says shalom from Indianapolis. Marina Gonzalez from North Hollywood, practically a neighbor. Melissa Teljurin is saying good afternoon from Great Neck, New York. Ed Berg from Galloway, New Jersey. Christo Cheney says hello again from Lubbock, Texas. Just caught up on the past broadcast that I miss. You know, whenever I hear Lubbock, Texas, I can't help but think maybe you know who it is, Christo. There was a comedian years ago from Lubbock. He was so funny, and he said, "Well, Lubbock's flat. It's so flat that on a clear day you can see the back of your head." I love that joke. Yehudit says shalom from Florence, South Carolina. Leslie Simon says howdy. Elizabeth Hunt Lucarini says shalom from Tucson. And Robin Rigsby says hi. Ann Dodge Schwantz is in from San Diego. Virginia Regan Hawkins from Encinitas. Robin is in from Florida. And Ralph Bird says good day from... Where'd you go? It was just in front of me a moment ago. From Australia, the Academy of Scuba in Australia. And Krista says, yeah, it's very flat out here. Deborah Shadone says shalom from Denver. And Lynn is in the house from North Texas. All right. Let's see if we can work our way through this daf. As always, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the comments section. Nina will pass them over to me, and I'll try to address all of them if possible at the end of my teaching. All right. We are on Daf 124. That's Kuf Chaf Dalet. We're in Tractate Shabbos, the second volume in the Talmud. We're in chapter 17, which is all about the principle of Muktzeh, the idea that objects which have no legitimate use on Shabbos, we don't even touch them so that we don't come to do that prohibited labor that object is normally used for. So the example is our tools, right? A saw or a carpenter's hammer or, all kinds of, socket wrenches, all these kinds of tools. What they're normally used for, construction, is a prohibited labor on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, I'm not going to do that labor. I'm not even going to touch the tool. But we're seeing that there's exceptions to that because we may need to move the tool, either because we're going to use it for a permitted use, right? A socket wrench, I can't use it to do construction, but maybe I can use it to, open a bottle or something. Maybe I can use it to open a beer bottle. I can open a beer bottle on Shabbos, and I could even use my socket wrench if I have that kind of clever trick to open the beer bottle. Or if the socket wrench was left on the dinner table and it's time to have dinner on our table, we don't want that socket wrench there, so we can move it even though it would otherwise be Muktzeh. That's the general principle of this chapter 17, and now we're getting into the nuances of it. Let's start with the fourth Mishnah. This is the fourth Mishnah of chapter 17. All vessels, in fact, let me read it straight from the book. All vessels may be moved for a specific purpose and not for a specific purpose. Rabbi Nehemiah says vessels may only be moved for a specific purpose. Now, as we're going to see, Rabbi Nehemiah is much more stringent about these rules of what we can touch and move and use on Shabbos. He's so stringent that the law does not follow Rabbi Nehemiah. And because the law doesn't follow Rabbi Nehemiah, his views are a little bit unclear. And the other sages disagree about what Rabbi Nehemiah was saying. What difference does it make what Rabbi Nehemiah is saying if everybody agrees that the law doesn't go by Nehemiah? Well, it does matter because this is the Talmud, and our sages want to understand a view even if it's not the majority view, even if it's not the view that we follow, we still want to understand it. And that's very important. And I would say this is something that the Talmud has contributed to society, right? This idea that we don't just follow the majority to understand it and to obey the law. We don't just study what the king says. I mean, remember, there was no such thing as democracy for most of the history of the world. But the sages did have democracy. The majority of the sages would rule on something and the law would follow the majority. Eventually we'll get to the story where they worked out why and how important that was. But they do follow the majority, but they also preserve the minority opinions, and not only preserve them, but study them, because at some future time the world may change, conditions may change, and that minority opinion may come into play, and we need to know and we need to understand it. So even though Rabbi Nehemiah's view was not fully explored and people disagree what it means, they still take it seriously. We don't follow it, but we want to know what it means, and they just never came to agreement on what Rabbi Nehemiah's opinion means. We're going to get to that. But the first question is, the Mishnah says that all vessels may be moved on Shabbos for a specific purpose and not for a specific purpose. All right, we know what a vessel is. A vessel is some kind of container. There's going to be different rules about different vessels, particularly with respect to their status in terms of ritual purity or impurity, depending on what material they're made out of. But generally, a vessel is some kind of a receptacle. It's capable of holding something in it. So now all vessels may be moved for a specific purpose or not for a specific purpose. What does the Mishnah mean by a specific purpose? It seems like simple language. Well, you have a purpose to do something specific or you don't. But it's not clear. And as we'll see, we're going to get into an argument. What does specific purpose mean? Whatever the specific purpose means, whatever it means, Rabbi Nehemiah says vessels may only be moved for a specific purpose. Now, Either Rabbi Nehemiah means that you can only move tools, vessels that have a permitted use on Shabbos for that use, right? So for example, according to Rabbi Nehemiah, a knife and fork. A knife and fork is used for eating. Eating is certainly a permitted activity on Shabbos. The knife and fork have a permitted use. But according to one possibility of Rabbi Nehemiah, what he's saying is, I can move a knife and fork if I'm going to eat with them. But if I'm not going to eat with them, I don't touch the knife and fork. That's one possibility of what Rabbi Nehemiah means. The second possibility is, I move them only for the permitted use, even if they are designated for a prohibited use, and this excludes move for place or to preserve the vessel, as we will see. So here, Rabbi Nehemiah is going to be that this view of what Rabbi Nehemiah means is that a knife and fork can be moved to use it for the use of a knife and fork, but because a knife and fork are designed for a permitted use, if I just need with the spot where the knife and fork are, I can move the knife and fork. But if we're talking about the socket wrench, which is not designed for permitted use on Shabbos, I'm not going to be allowed to move it at all, right? Not even for its place, not for anything. All right, we're going to get back to Rabbi Nehemiah as we discuss the two big views of this Mishnah. Even their names are confusing. The argument is going to be between Rabbah and Rava. Okay, so these are different guys, Rabbah and Rava. They're both Amoraim in Bavel. They are discussing what the Mishnah means. And as we'll see, what they're really arguing about is what does it mean for a specific purpose. Okay, first the view of Rabbah. Rabbah says, we may move an object. So now he's going to expand vessel to object, meaning a vessel or a utensil. For the purposes of this argument now, we're not going to distinguish between vessels and utensils. A vessel is a receptacle of some sort. A utensil is some kind of a tool. But either way, the question is, are they designed to be used for an activity that is permitted on Shabbos or that's prohibited on Shabbos, right? So a fork is designed for an activity that's permitted on Shabbos, eating. The socket wrench is designed for an activity that is prohibited on Shabbos, construction. Okay, according to Rabbah, an object that is designed for a permitted use, the fork, we may move it for that use. That's moving for a specific purpose. Now, the Mishnah says we can move for a specific purpose or not for a specific purpose. So first, moving for a specific purpose, according to Rabbah, that means we can take the fork and use it for eating. Okay, that's simple. What does it mean that we may move it not for a specific purpose? This comes to include, number one, the permitted use object, meaning the fork which is designed for a permitted use. And we can move it to use it as a fork for eating, or we can move it because we need its place. The fork happens to be sitting, on a side table where I want to rest my books while I'm reading Torah. I'm studying Torah, certainly a permitted activity on Shabbos, and I want to sit in somebody left a fork on the side table next to my easy chair, and I want to rest my books there. So I'm going to move the fork because I need its place. No problem. It's an object made to be used for something that's permitted on Shabbos. And now I'm not using it for eating. I just need it for its place. That's moving it not for a specific purpose. Okay. Permitted, maybe move for their place. And I can also move not for a specific purpose. This is the second category of what's included in moving something not for a specific purpose. Now we take the prohibited use object, meaning the socket wrench. The socket wrench is designed for an activity that's prohibited on Shabbos. Now, I can move the socket wrench. According to Rabbah, I can move it for its place, right? It was resting on my side table. I want to put my books there instead, so I can move the socket wrench. I can also move it for a permitted use. The socket wrench is designed to be used for construction. That's prohibited on Shabbos. But I can repurpose my socket wrench on Shabbos to use it to open a beer bottle. That I can do. That's a permitted use of an object normally designed for a prohibited activity. Both of those, moving the socket wrench for its place or using the socket wrench for a permitted use, are what Rabbah would call using it not for a specific purpose. And this is going to be permitted on Shabbos. According to Rabbah, Rabbi Nehemiah's stringent prohibition, his stringent opinion, means that he would not even move a permitted use object for its place. In other words, Nehemiah would say, if you want to pick up that fork to eat with it, go right ahead. But if you needed to move the fork off the side table because you wanted to rest your books there, no, you don't touch the fork. Right? Rabbi Nehemiah's view of Muktzeh is super stringent, and that's why nobody follows it. Recall that this whole concept of Muktzeh, of not even touching objects because they might lead us to do some kind of prohibited activity, it's a rabbinic decree to protect us from violating a Torah prohibition, and generally we interpret rabbinic decrees leniently. That's why nobody holds like Rabbi Nehemiah. He's being too stringent about something that is already a fence around the Torah. We're only stringent with Torah laws, we're lenient with rabbinic decrees. Rabbi Nehemiah is too stringent about a rabbinic decree. Now we come to Rabbah's interlocutor, right? The person who disputes Rabbah, and this is Rava with a V as in Victor. Rabbah with a B as in boy. Rabbah, we just explained what he means, specific purpose and not for a specific purpose. Rava says, no, you're wrong, Rabbah. Why? Because you're saying that when we move something for its place, you include that in not a specific purpose. And is moving something because I need its place not a specific purpose? I'm moving it for a specific purpose because I need its place. Rather, when we say that something is moved for a specific purpose, we include the permitted use object, that's the fork, and we can move it either for its permitted use to eat with it or for its place because I need the spot where it was sitting. When we say that we're moving an object not for a specific purpose, now we're talking about either moving a permitted use object, not just that. Okay, now Rav is adding something new. Not only can we move the fork because we want to eat with it or because we need its place, but number three, a whole new category, a whole new reason for moving something, because we want to move it from the sun to the shade. What does he mean by that? There are certain objects that if we leave them sitting out in the sun, right, and particularly in the Holy Land, right, in the desert, in the summer, where it's baking hot, so hot, certain objects, if we leave them out there in the sun, they could really get damaged. So we might have forgot it out there on Friday. We just forgot. We were so busy getting ready for Shabbos. And then come Saturday morning, I go to take a walk outside and I'm like, oh man, I left, I don't even know what's a good example of this. But let's just say that I have a fork that for some reason, if it sits out there in the sun, it's going to get damaged. I can't think of a better object at this moment. But let's say that this fork, it has some, it has a patina. It has a certain finish that if I leave it out there in the sun, it's just going to get ruined if it sits out in the sun for several hours. So can I move it inside? So if it's a permitted use object, right, the fork is designed for an activity that is permitted on Shabbos, then according to Rava, I can also move it from the sun to the shade. I'm not moving it in order to use it for eating. I'm not moving it because I need its place, right? Because I wanted to put books in the spot on the table where it's now resting. Rather, I'm going to move it just to preserve the object from damage. And if it's a permitted use object, like a fork, Rava says that's okay under this permit in the Mishnah that we can move things on Shabbos for a specific purpose or not for a specific purpose. This comes under not for a specific purpose. With regard to prohibited use objects, like the socket wrench, I can move the socket wrench in order to use it to open the beer bottle. I can move the socket wrench because I need its place on the side table, but I may not move it from the sun to the shade just in order to preserve the socket wrench from sun damage, right? To preserve the object from damage, I cannot move it if it's a prohibited use object. That's how Rava defines Muktzeh on Shabbos. And then with respect to what Rabbi Nehemiah, his ultra stringent opinion, Rava interprets Nehemiah as saying that the permitted use object, like the fork, it may be moved to be used for eating or for its place on the side table, but not from the sun to the shade. So Rava interprets Nehemiah a little he's saying that Nehemiah is not quite as stringent as you're accusing him of being, but still he would not allow the permitted use object to be moved from the sun to the shade. And it goes without saying that he would not allow that for the prohibited use object, the socket wrench. All right. That is working our way through the difference between Rabba and Rava. And the law, the halacha, is like Rava, right? So to review, the law is like Rava. So things that are permitted to be used that are designed for permitted use object, like a fork, which is designed to be used for eating, we can obviously move it so that we can eat with it. We can move it because we need its place, and we can save it from harm by taking it from the sun to the shade. A prohibited use object, like a socket wrench, we can move it on Shabbos to do something that's permitted with it, like opening the beer bottle. We can move it because we need its place, like it's on the side table and I want to move it so I can rest my books there. But we cannot move the socket wrench from the sun to the shade to, prevent it from being harmed through sun damage. That is the law. Okay. And now that we're talking about, well, what is the law? We're going to get to something that's interesting about the law, right? We introduced this section by saying, we've said earlier that holidays and Shabbos have the same laws, except that on a holiday I can cook, right? On Passover, on Shavuos, on Sukkot, on Rosh Hashanah, I can cook. Otherwise, I can't do work, I can't be writing, I can't do construction, I'm not going to be carrying things from the private domain to the public domain. All of those laws are the same. The only difference is cooking. But is that the only difference? So now we hear there's a difference between the followers, the Academy of Shammai, so the house of Shammai, Beis Shammai, and Beis Hillel, the followers of Hillel. So Beis Shammai would say that on a holiday, you can, just like Shabbos, you can't carry a child from the private domain out into the public domain. You can't carry a lulav, that's a palm branch that we use during Sukkot. It's part of the observance of Sukkot that we wave a palm branch as well as 3 other species. And even a Torah. You can't carry a Torah from the private domain out into the public domain. Beis Hillel say, yes, we can do those things because we need to do those things in order to observe the holiday properly. So they override what would otherwise be the same law as Shabbos with respect to carrying, and the law is the same as Shabbos with respect to carrying all other objects, but these 3, we want to be able to carry them so that we can observe the holiday properly. So it was carved out that we can carry a child, a Torah, or a lulav on holidays, though we may not carry them on Shabbos. That is the law. And so we see that there's a difference there, right? We say, well, what is the law? Okay, but the followers of Shammai have a different definition of the law than the followers of Hillel. Now, many times we've seen that one sage holds one way, another sage holds the other way. And then usually I will say to you, and the law is. But sometimes the law doesn't get set that way for everybody, and a division actually remains even in the religious, Orthodox Jewish world. Even in the ultra-Orthodox, there's going to be differences of practice, what some groups do, other groups don't do, and then they have to keep straight. Do we hold by this or do we hold by that? We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Now, Rav, so we've talked about Rabba and Rav. We talked about Rabba and Rava. Now we're going to bring down Rav. Okay, so Rav says that we may not move a hoe, that's a garden tool or a farm tool, to avoid theft. So that's the same idea as moving from the sun to the shade. Some allow it, some don't, right? Rava would allow us to move from the sun to the shade, something that's designed for a permitted use on Shabbos, but a hoe is not. A hoe, what's a hoe for? A hoe is used for digging in the ground to plant seeds and stuff. That's not something we can do on Shabbos. So we can move the hoe if we need its place. We can move the hoe if we can actually do something permitted with it, but we may not move it to get it from the sun to the shade or to prevent it from being stolen, right? We can't preserve the object by moving it on Shabbos. We should have taken care of that on Friday. So then Rav Mari bar Rachel. Rachel? Wait a minute. Let me just make sure I got this right, because that's an unusual name. Give me 1 second. Where'd he go? Yeah, Rav Mari bar Rachel. I guess he's named after his mom. Okay, usually the sages are named after their dads, but for some reason I need to learn a little bit more about Rav Mari bar Rachel. So that's kind of unusual. Okay, so Rav Mari bar Rachel brings a question, and who does he ask? He comes before Rava. Okay, so we know that Rava, generally the law follows Rava on this particular issue. Right, so he allows us, if it's the fork, we can go from sun to shade with it. The socket wrench, we cannot move it from the sun to the shade. And all the other things we can move for their place or for a permitted use. Okay, that's Rava. So now Rav Mari bar Rachel brings this question to Rava. He says, I have felt cushions and they're out here in the sun. What is the law with respect to carrying them? Rava says, well, you can carry them, right? What are these felt cushions for? They're for sitting. Sitting on, that's a permitted thing on Shabbos, so you can move the felt cushions. But Rav Mari bar Rachel says, well, the thing is, I have enough cushions inside for the people who are here. I don't need them for their use. So Rava said, well, you can still move them, because you might have more guests dropping in. If more guests drop in, you're going to need those cushions. So you could move them. He says, oh, I have lots of cushions inside. I have enough for my people who are here, and even if a ton of guests arrive, I have enough. Really what I want to do is get these cushions out of the sun, because they're felt cushions and they're going to be damaged by the sun. So here's a real world issue brought up about this question about moving from the sun to the shade. And Rava answers Rav Mari bar Rachel, now I understand what you're asking me. I hold by my own ruling that something that's made for a permitted use on Shabbos, we can move it from the sun to the shade. But you hold by Rava. Presumably, Rava knew that Rav Mari bar Rachel was a follower of Rabba, was in the school of Rabba, lived in the region of the country where Rabba was the authority. For whatever reason, he knows that Rav Mari bar Rachel holds like Rabba. Rabba does not permit moving something from the sun to the shade on Shabbos, even if that thing is designed for a permitted use on Shabbos. So he says to Rav Mari, I can move cushions out of the sun, but you can't. For you, it's prohibited. And so right there we see that there's a real difference. Often this is called hashkafa. Hashkafa basically means worldview. And so this is a term that's used within the religious, the Orthodox Jewish world, to denote that there are differences even in that world between different groups. Something that comes up now in modern times, for example, is listening to non-Jewish music, listening to rock and roll, right? So all Orthodox leaders will say that you cannot listen to rock and roll with explicit lyrics, right? You can't listen to vulgarity, to curse words, to stuff that's all about, sex and things that are, not within our worldview. But if it's kosher in the sense that it's not about sex, it doesn't have curse words, it's not about, murdering people, etc. It doesn't have any of that kind of content in it. Okay, so the modern Orthodox world, people will listen to non-Jewish music as long as it doesn't contain that explicit type of content. But in the more Haredi world, the more Hasidic world, they will not even listen to this music that is made by non-Jewish artists about non-Jewish topics. That's a hashkafic difference. Another kind of difference like that comes up is the Eruv, right? So we've been talking a lot about an Eruv, where you can, using poles and fishing line, you can make a sort of legal construction. It's a physical construction, but for a legal purpose, around a community so that people in that community can carry on Shabbos. It's as if they're carrying in their own courtyard, even though they're walking around their neighborhood, going from their house to a friend's house or from their house to synagogue, so they can carry. Makes life much more livable if you hold by the Eruv. You can push a stroller, you can carry a tallis bag, you can carry a key in your pocket. But some people, it's not a small number, don't hold by an Eruv. They think actually, no, it's too big of a legal fiction, it's too big of a legal construction. They'll carry things around their own courtyard, but they prefer not to carry, they don't hold by the Eruv. And so the Chabad community in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, doesn't hold by an Eruv. It's a huge community. They really control their neighborhood. They could easily have an Eruv there, keep close watch on it, and make sure that it's always intact. But they don't hold by an Eruv, so they just don't make use of it. Other communities do hold by an Eruv. So, sometimes when you're talking to somebody, who's going to come over to lunch, they're going to come from shul, or recently, for example, we've been having a backyard minyan on Friday nights during the pandemic. And because it's the pandemic, it's outside, we're social distancing, everyone's wearing a mask. And whereas the host of our minyan normally provides prayer books, during the pandemic, we're saying everybody bring your own prayer book. Well, how can you bring your own prayer book unless you have an Eruv? We do have an Eruv here in LA, and it does get checked on Fridays, but some people don't hold by the Eruv. So the people who hold by the Eruv will bring their own prayer book. The ones who don't hold by the Eruv will come without a prayer book, and they know the prayers well enough they can sing along without having the prayer book in front of them. And that's a hashkafic difference that comes up even within the very religious community. Okay. And that brings us to Mishnah number 5. All vessels that may be moved on Shabbos, their shards may be moved also, as long as they are suited for some purpose, right? So get in your mind, like a clay pot. Okay, a clay pot is a vessel, it's a container. We can move it on Shabbos from the living room to the dining room. A clay pot that has broken, right? So now it's composed of shards. Well, what's a shard useful for? It's just like a broken piece of a clay pot. But if it's a large enough shard, it actually is still a receptacle. It can just hold less than what the original clay pot could hold. But the shard may also be able to function as a smaller receptacle, or even not as a receptacle, but just as a piece that can be used as like a lid, as a cover on something. Like, let's say you had a glass of water, you were going to go outside and hang out for a while. You were concerned that insects would fly into your glass of water. So you could use this shard from the clay pot as a lid on that glass of water. So it would not be its original intended purpose of being a receptacle for something. Now it could be used as a lid, but the point is it has a purpose. So all vessels may be moved on Shabbos, and their shards may be moved too, as long as they have some purpose. Rabbi Yehuda says they may only be moved, the shards may only be moved if they can serve the same purpose that the original object had. So Rabbi Yehuda would say, if you're going to use the shard of the clay pot as a receptacle, like the clay pot was a receptacle, okay, you can use the shard, but to use it as a lid over a glass of water, no, it was not intended for that use. So if you can't use it as a receptacle, it has now become Muktzeh. We don't touch it on Shabbos, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Zutre brings a baraisa, a different teaching from the same period as the Mishnah, regarding a festival, that on a festival, on a Jewish holiday, we may kindle a fire with whole vessels, but not with their shards. So when you're talking about kindling a fire, so he's referring to wooden vessels. Now imagine a wooden bowl. So a wooden bowl is a vessel. It's made out of wood. So if I had no other wood lying around and I needed to burn something so that I could prepare some food, this is why we're talking about a holiday, not on Shabbos. So I can set my wooden bowl on fire and make a fire with it so that I could cook some meat. But not its shards, right? So what I'm not going to be able to do is break up that bowl, which is what I'd really want to do if I wanted to start a fire. But according to this baraisa, I can burn the whole vessel. I can't burn the shards of the vessel. Now, why not, right? If the wooden bowl was broken before the holiday started, okay, so, the shards of a wooden vessel, it's just wood. It's useful as fuel. So if it broke before the holiday started, why couldn't I burn it during the holiday? I could burn it during the holiday. So what this baraisa is teaching us is we can't burn the shards of a wooden vessel where the shards came into existence during the festival. In other words, the wood bowl broke during the festival. Why? Because before the festival, these shards didn't exist. Now, after the festival began, the wood bowl broke and the shards came into existence. They are new. They came into existence during the holiday. This is a principle called nolad, N-O-L-A-D, if you want to spell it out in English, nolad. So nolad is something that came into being. The classic example is an egg. What if a hen laid an egg on Shabbos? Can we eat the egg, right? Can we eat the egg? Now, you can't cook the egg, but let's say it happened during the festival. During the festival, we can cook. Now, the egg didn't exist before the festival. It existed inside the hen, but it didn't exist as a separate object. So it came into being during the festival. Therefore, it was not prepared for use on the festival. It is nolad, and we don't eat that egg on the festival. Likewise with the shards of the wooden bowl. Now we go back to the Mishnah. So is it referring to shards that were created before Shabbos or during? Now we're talking about the clay pot again. If the shards existed before Shabbos, in other words, the clay pot broke before Shabbos began. So before Shabbos began, let's say I had two clay pots, one of them broke, so I have a whole clay pot and I have the broken pieces of the second clay pot, and I have all those things before Shabbos even begins. Okay, so now the question is, can I use? For sure, I can use the clay pot that's whole during Shabbos. What about the shards? They came into being before Shabbos, so we don't have the nolad issue. They existed before Shabbos, so they were prepared for some use. If I can use them as a receptacle, I can use them as a receptacle. There's no problem. If they're too small to be used as a receptacle, they're too small to be used as a lid over a glass, if they don't really have any purpose, okay, then they're muktzeh because they have no purpose, right? I don't touch them because they have no purpose. Presumably, if I need their place, I could move them for that, because we've said that things that, even if they have not a permitted purpose, we can move them for their place, but we'll avoid that if possible, right? Now, what if the clay pot broke during Shabbos, right? If they were created during Shabbos, so now they're nolad. They came into being during Shabbos. So Rabbi Yehuda would say, well, if they serve the same purpose, if, in other words, the shard is large enough to be a receptacle, the original thing that was prepared for use on Shabbos was a clay pot. In this case, it broke. I have two clay pots. One of them broke during Shabbos, right? So before Shabbos, they were just whole clay pots. What was their use, their permitted use on Shabbos? As receptacles. Now, during Shabbos, one of them broke, and so I no longer have the second clay pot. What I do have is these shards, which are new. If they can be used as a receptacle, so then they were prepared for use on Shabbos because they were part of a receptacle when Shabbos began, when Shabbos came in. And now, even though they broke off, they're still being used as a receptacle, so they're going to be permitted. But if they cannot be used as a receptacle, then they're just nolad, they're new, they're muktzeh, they can't be used for anything because they didn't exist before. They were prepared for use. That's according to Rabbi Yehuda. According to the sages, they were prepared for use before Shabbos because they were part of a vessel that was thought to be used, the big clay pot. Now it broke during Shabbos. They came into being, and I could use them, the shards, either as a receptacle if they're big enough, or as a lid over a glass of water. They have some specific purpose. If they're so small that they have no specific purpose, then it's prohibited to move them. Then they become muktzeh because they're nolad, and then I would only move them if I need their place or because they're dangerous, because it's a hazard if somebody might step on it and hurt themselves. And that is the law. And that is the law. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let me check your comments and questions. Okay, Lynn in Texas says, this daf really stumped me. This one's tough. I mean, it just took me an extra hour of going through it a second time, trying to keep straight who is saying what. Writing it out makes it so much easier to follow when we get into these complex streams, when two different points of view are being debated and the two different points of view have implications that ripple out into other situations. Cynthia Lentz, a candle left on the porch would be damaged in the sun. Beautiful. So there's an example of something. Now the candle, if we lit it before Shabbos, right, it then becomes muktzeh. We don't move a candle. We light Shabbos candles, but then we can't touch them or move them because they're muktzeh. We don't touch the candles. And if we didn't light it, if it's right, then it's this object that doesn't have a permitted use on Shabbos. You can't light a candle during Shabbos, right? You can't light it during Shabbos. So that's definitely an item designed for a prohibited use on Shabbos. Now, could we move the candle because somebody left it on the dining table and we want to eat there? Yes, now we're moving it for its place. Could we do something with it? I can't imagine what we would do with a candle that is not its intended use but would be a permitted activity. I suppose you could use it as a paperweight. Like if you just wanted it to keep, like you had a long candle and it was windy and outside and the window was open and I just wanted my page as I'm reading not to blow over, I could use the candle for that. But let me finish your question. Or a case of bottled water, very good, where the heat and sun would release chemicals from the plastic into drinking water bottles. They should be moved to the shade, right? Or maybe receiving grocery delivery in front porch. Now, we don't move deliveries. This is interesting. I guess, like Amazon boxes, we don't touch them. Now, we're afraid it's going to be stolen. this is tricky because maybe we don't know what's in the box, right? And if what's in the box has a permitted use on Shabbos, then we would be able to protect it, from the sun or from theft. But we don't know what's in the box, so we're probably going to not touch it. Most people don't touch their Amazon delivery boxes. But the water bottles, that's a perfect example. The water bottles that are sitting in the sun, it's like, oh no, I don't want them in the sun. So they certainly have a permitted use. I can drink water from those water bottles on Shabbos. If they're going to be damaged in the sun, I can move them into the shade. Gil Erez, I'm sorry, that's just an off-topic question. Lucy Ram Johnson, when I study the Torah, it is most of the time using electronic text on my computer. So can I do this on Shabbat? No, you cannot. We don't use our screens. Now, a good question is, well, can I just leave the TV on, right? Like this question comes up especially during the World Series. There's going to be a World Series game on Shabbos. Excuse me. Can we just leave the TV on Friday afternoon and just let it play all through Shabbos? And we'll do it in another room so it won't bother us. But while the game is on, we could go in and see the game. And the answer is we don't do that for the same reason that we wouldn't leave a water mill, like a mill that grinds flour powered by a stream. And we wouldn't leave grain in the mill to be ground down into flour during Shabbos, even though we wouldn't be doing anything on Shabbos. We wouldn't, it would just be on autopilot. But the reason we allow cholent to keep cooking so that it's ready for lunch on Shabbos, but we don't allow flour to be ground in a water mill is because the grinding of the mill is loud and it attracts attention. And it says, this is work being done on Shabbos, and maybe the person doesn't know that we don't do work on Shabbos. In other words, it basically boils down to it's not Shabbos-like. It's not Shabbistic, right? And so likewise with TVs and screens, they have to go off on Friday. So your question, it's like you're in this situation where you do most of your Torah study using electronic tools. But if you're going to be halachic Jew, a Shomer Shabbos Jew, then you have to get some hard copy books to read those on Shabbos because we don't use our screens on Shabbos. Doc Wolf says, the story is his mother was a captive, so he's named for... about Mari. Thank you. So this is about, what was his name? Ravi Bar Rachel. Was it Ravi Bar Rachel? Just want to get his name right. Hold on. Yeah, Rav Mari Bar Rachel. And Doc Wolf says the story is that his mother was a captive, and so he was named for her rather than the father who was her captor. Thank you. So there was some kind of a war. His mother, who was Jewish, was captured by a non-Jew. Essentially, she was raped, right, and held as a slave. And then this man fathered a child by his slave, and he ends up becoming one of the sages. So he is named after his Jewish mother rather than the captor/rapist, who became his father. Thank you, Doc Wolf. That's great to know. Okay, that's all the questions that I'm seeing. And what was this one? Ann Dom says, is there a spiritual purpose of refraining from using pieces of the bowl that broke during Shabbos to feed a cooking fire, or is feeding a cooking fire work on Shabbos? Right, so we don't cook on Shabbos. That's only on holidays, right? On holidays we can cook. We refrain from feeding the pieces that broke on Shabbos. It's not really a spiritual thing. It's just this concept of nolad. Where this really does get spiritual big time is the philosophy, the underlying philosophy of Muktzeh, right? The idea that we're not going to touch things that might lead us to work. It's not just preventing us from accidentally coming to violate a Torah prohibition. It's saying to us, Shabbos is another planet, right? Or as Abraham Joshua Heschel famously said, Shabbos is a palace in time, right? So when we get to Friday afternoon, we're scrambling, we're getting ready for Shabbos, and then evening comes in, and it becomes the time, it's candle lighting time. We light those candles, and we're like in a different country, we're in a different nation, we're on a different planet. Everything is different. And so we look at everything around us as if it's different. Everything has been transformed. And that's why Rabbi Nehemiah, who was more stringent than anyone else, and we don't hold by Rabbi Nehemiah, and he says we only touch things in order to do a permitted activity. We don't even touch them if it's not for the permitted activity. He's not crazy. He's just saying, we're so in a lofty and soulful place on Shabbos that we'd rather not interact with the material world unless it's strictly necessary. That's what he's really saying, right? On Shabbos, remember I always say to you, we don't have souls, we are souls. We have bodies. On Shabbos, another portion of our soul that is normally sort of stays behind in the world of souls when we come here to live a human lifetime, that portion that stays beyond, it kind of comes here and joins us. It's still hidden from our conscious self, right? We're still human beings, and we can't peer into heaven, we can't peer into the spiritual world, which remains hidden from us. But we have an extra measure of soul on Shabbos, and that extra measure of soul sort of sparks us to have a soulful existence on Shabbos. And so hashkafically, philosophically, worldview-wise, right, on Shabbos, we really want to feel like, the material world is our home. And we were sent here to elevate the material world and to make it a home for God, to make it a home for the divine presence. But on Shabbos, we cease the work of transforming the physical world into a home for God, and we just focus on the spiritual home for God. We are souls, we're here with other souls, we're elevating our souls. God comes down and, sends a little bit extra measure of the divine presence on Shabbos. And we really try to connect with ourselves and each other and God as spiritual beings on Shabbos. And so the philosophy behind all of this is really just to minimize contact with the material world. Understanding, of course, that we are material beings and we have needs and we want to eat, and enjoying Shabbos involves a whole lot of material things. And that's why we don't go too crazy with this idea of becoming and connecting as spiritual beings on Shabbos. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Sending you all big love. Tomorrow's Thursday. God willing, we'll be back to the normal time, 6 p.m. Pacific. And then Friday, we'll do the Friday schedule because Shabbos comes in Friday evening. And so we'll go about noon Pacific on